Hello and welcome to week 10 in Introduction to Linguistics. This week we're going to continue the topic that we began last week, in particular syntax. We're now beginning to go into larger and larger units of language, building up from the word. Words are grouped into phrases to add additional meaning, to express meaning beyond individual words alone. And then phrases can be combined into larger phrases and ultimately into sentences, which then can express fuller meanings. So today we want to look in a little more detail at how we actually represent the meaning relationships within phrases. Last week we studied very briefly some kind of an introduction to what's known as X-bar theory or X-bar representations. These are essentially phrase structure rules for combining words into phrases. And some of the words come from the lexicon, from our memory for the words we know in the language we know. And some of the words come from the grammar. Some words are introduced as part of the process of combining words together. Not only words, but additional morphemes, morphological features, including grammatical features such as tense or plural and others. Today we're going to focus on English, and then next week we'll see how some other languages differ from English in various syntactic properties. So last week we looked at the different lexical categories or grammatical categories or syntactic categories. I use all of these terms to identify nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions. And we identified a general principle for how phrases are built from these lexical categories. And the generalization was termed kind of XP, for a kind of phrase. So any phrase, as you see here, an XP, it can be made up of an optional specifier and then an obligatory X bar. Now X gets replaced with a particular type of category. So if we're talking about a verb phrase is divided into an optional specifier and an obligatory V bar for verb. And then the V bar itself is further divided into an obligatory head, the verb, and then an optional complement. If it's a noun phrase, well, the noun phrase is divided into an optional specifier and an obligatory N bar. And the N bar in turn is divided into an obligatory head, the noun, and an optional complement. So we want to just look more specifically at these particular examples of XP syntax or XP structure. So in the case of a noun phrase, the specifier might be a determiner. Determiners are words like the or our, something that determines a specific reference to the noun that is the head of the phrase. So a noun phrase would be made up of an optional determiner and an obligatory N bar. The N bar can then be divided into the obligatory head, the noun, and an optional complement, which could be, for example, a prepositional phrase. Now the three dots that come after the prepositional phrase indicate there are some other complements that are possible. But by now you should have noticed that the bold letters represent the obligatory members of the phrase, and the kind of lighter, thinner letters and the parentheses indicate optional members of the phrase. Now, as I say, prepositional phrases are possible complements for the noun in a noun phrase, but there are some others as well that we'll see later. But we'll start with this one. In the case of the verb phrase, verbs can... let me have an example, right? So take, for example, the word meetings. Right? Meetings is a noun. It's a plural noun. I can then add additional meaning by adding a complement, right? Meetings on Friday, right? Where on Friday is a prepositional phrase, on is a preposition, Friday is actually a noun phrase inside the prepositional phrase, but for now we can simply recognize it as a prepositional phrase that is the complement of meetings. It completes the idea, or it completes the meaning expressed with meetings. Now, I could also add an additional specifier. Right? I could refer to the meetings on Friday. Others are some meetings on Friday, those meetings on Friday. There are a number of other possible specifiers, but this would be an example of a noun phrase with meetings as the head, on Friday as the complement, and the as the specifier. Now, in the case of verb phrases, an optional specifier would be an auxiliary verb. So noun phrases and verb phrases are different in the types of specifiers they can take. Verb phrases must have a V bar, and the V bar must contain a verb. But if the verb phrase also has an optional specifier, it could be an auxiliary verb. This would be like a modal, like may or might, should or would, will, which is used to mark future tense, although grammatically it really is an auxiliary verb. And it's possible to have a complement, right? The verb could take a noun phrase as a complement. And again, you'll see the 3 dots indicating that there are some alternatives as well. But again, not every verb phrase has a complement. Not every verb phrase has a specifier. But every verb phrase must have a verb. In fact, that's a general principle, that every phrase must have a head, and every head must be contained in its corresponding phrase. Now, in the case of a verb phrase, we might take the verb walk. Right? So, I walk. I don't have to have any other words in the verb phrase. I could have a verb phrase that has a V bar, which contains only the verb walk. Or I could add a complement. I could walk the dog. Right? The dog is a noun phrase that could be the complement of the verb walk. Or I could add a specifier. Will walk the dog. Right? So it's possible to have optional specifier, optional complement, but the verb itself is obligatory. In the case of an adjective phrase must have an adjective as the head. It can take a noun phrase as a complement. That's not the only possible complement, although it is the most common. And it's possible to take a specifier, which would be a degree word. Degree meaning some expression of the degree to which something contains the property expressed by the adjective. So an adjective would be a word like old. Right? Old can be used as an adjective by itself. He is old. But old as an adjective, the head of the phrase, can also take a complement, like a noun phrase, such as buildings. Buildings is a noun phrase, a plural noun. This particular noun phrase doesn't have a specifier or a complement, but it does have the head noun, buildings. Old buildings would be an adjective phrase. Old is the head, and buildings is the complement. Now, if I were to add an additional specifier to this adjective phrase, it would be a degree word like very. It expresses the degree of old, very old buildings. Or in the case of prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases must have a P bar, which must have a P, right? The obligatory elements in the phrase. It can have an optional complement or an optional specifier, as we have seen. And for prepositional phrases also, a specifier would be a degree word. And then one of the possible complements for a prepositional phrase is the noun phrase. Indeed, it's the most common. And so take a preposition like before. Before is a preposition by itself. If I were to add a complement, it would be a noun phrase, such as before the lecture. Right? We chatted before the lecture. Now, if I also wanted to introduce a specifier, it would be a degree word that is emphasizing something about the degree to which the preposition meaning is intended. So right before the lecture means not a long time before the lecture, but immediately before, which could be a degree word, just before, right before. Any of these would be possible specifiers in a prepositional phrase. So if you look carefully, one very important property is that each of these phrase types can also be possible complements. So in a noun phrase, for example, you could have a prepositional phrase as a complement of the head noun. But then the prepositional phrase itself would then have to have a P bar and a head P, which could in turn also have a noun phrase as a complement. Or a verb phrase might have a noun phrase as a complement. And then that noun phrase that is the complement would then in turn have its own N bar and head noun. So you can see that we can develop quite sophisticated sentence structures through this property of sentences, which is not limited to English. It's a property of sentences in all languages. And the property is known as iterative phrase structure rules. Phrase structural rules can iterate, which is to say they can be applied repeatedly or successively inside each of the other phrases. So a verb phrase containing a noun phrase, and the noun phrase containing a prepositional phrase, and the prepositional phrase containing another noun phrase, can make for rather complex meanings that we can express. Now, we're going to simplify that. We're going to begin by looking at some of the simple structures and then gradually build up to them. But in the next video, I'll take you step by step through building phrase structures for first phrases, and then phrases that are combined together into larger phrases, and then into